When a killer murders close family members during a short time period, it's called familicide. When the parents are killed, it's called parricide. When all members of a family are killed, it usually is referred to as family annihilation. Typically these murders involve children, relatives, spouse, siblings or parents. In ancient times, family annihilations were used to punish someone for treason. In China, tyrannical rulers would murder the entire family of the previous ruler, to prevent uprisings. This would include all extended members of that family. In some cases, they would annihilate an entire clan for treason as well. This was also used in Nazi Germany, to punish the families of defectors, or anyone involved. In today's times, this method of punishment is no longer used in any part of the world, with the exception of North Korea, where entire families can be exterminated for either political reasons, or criminal behavior. However, this is not typical in North Korea. Usually that entire family will be put into a labor camp known as Kikon internment camp, where the entire family will work in a factory or in the agricultural field, or in coal mines, but it has happened in recent times. Although familicide is rare, it is the most common form of mass killings. In most cases, the family annihilator thinks they are sparing their family of suffering. This is usually imagined. A forensic psychologist and director of New York Forensic, a private consulting group in New York City, states that a family annihilator is usually suffering from some sort of psychosis. And in some cases, hallucinations. He said, they become delusional and believe that this is a way of sparing their wife and children from some horrific event that they imagine might occur, Beryl said. They think there's some satanic forces or there's some message they're receiving from God that says this is what needs to be done. Beryl states that the family annihilators' distorted view shows a depressive type of thinking and their desperation. A study published in the Howard Journal of Crime and Justice shows that out of 71 cases, 59 of them were male, and over half of them were in their 30s when they carried out the crimes. 81% of the men attempted or succeeded in killing themselves after the murders. Studies show that men who murder their families typically will follow through on Sundays, and in the month of August, which is a time when children are out of school. The most common method was stabbing, followed by carbon monoxide poisoning. Studies show that the vast majority are men who feel they are losing power or control, and this last act is their taking back that power. Some are financially strained. Dr. Neil Websdale, director of the National Domestic Violence Fatality Review Initiative and author of Familicidal Hearts published in 2010, stated the financial strain is usually a factor with family annihilators. Roughly a quarter to a third of family annihilation cases appear to have financial problems at their root, Websdale said. Often what we see here is a deep sense of male shame. Websdale says that they are often highly repressed people, and they're facing eviction, home repossession, or bankruptcy. Looming destitution. Dr. Websdale has done some extensive research into family annihilators. He was a keynote speaker on Familicide at a Canadian domestic violence prevention conference in Calgary, Canada. Let's listen to what he has to say.
We need to do reconnaissance in domestic violence cases, but we need to be aware that in cases like familicide particularly, we're also working with the haunting presence of the inexplicable. There is something in those cases that is very, very difficult to pin down, that clearly defies scientific logic, our best scientific logic. Doesn't mean to say we shouldn't try, but it puts things just a little bit in perspective. It seems to us from the latest research we have, and this research is in the process of being published by the American criminologist Jack Levin. What Jack did was to take newspaper articles documenting familicides, and he compared the first 4 months of 2008 with the last 4 months of 2008, i.e. that period subsequent to the September 2008 recession. And what Jack found was a doubling of the victims between those two periods. The later period had twice as many familicide victims as the former period. And this was a troubling trend. We know from our work that clearly unemployment, job loss, foreclosure on a mortgage, pending bankruptcy, these various calamities do affect not only the familicide rate, but perhaps even the intimate partner homicide rate. So this was a sort of a warning shot across the bow in terms of economic change and the way we need to perhaps prepare for that. So Jack's work was one finding. My own research, which I have been conducting for many years. I'm currently the director of the National Domestic Violence Fatality Review Initiative in the United States, and I've been involved in that work for the last 12 years. So I've gathered a lot of cases of familicide over the years. I've come across the files. I've actually sat in communities and reviewed those cases. I've sat and talked with family members, surviving family members. I've interviewed some perpetrators who've committed these atrocities. So my own interest in this has been sort of more broad-ranging in the sense that I haven't relied on newspaper articles. I've gone to a lot of what I call archival data and very detailed documentation. And what I've found is that familicide itself has increased, certainly over the last 20 years in the United States, for sure, and probably in Canada as well. But perhaps as far back as the end of World War II. So from the 50s, the beginning of the 50s, we see a slow increase in familicide. And in my new book, I actually chart that graphically. It's not perfect science. We know we've missed some cases, but it seems that the trend is increasing rather than decreasing. Now, that's, in some ways, that's a counterintuitive phenomenon, because if we look at the intimate partner homicide rate, certainly again in the United States, and I don't know if you've seen this same trend in Canada quite to this degree, but when we map the intimate partner homicide rate from the mid-70s to sort of the 2006, 7, 8, for the years we have last up data, there's been probably a 35% decrease in the intimate partner homicide rate. Now, this has perhaps been because we've had increased shelter services. It's perhaps because we have faster EMT responses in the inner city where the rates are higher. It's perhaps because we have all those legal mechanisms in place, etc. We're sending a message that this behavior is unacceptable. There are lots of potential reasons for this. So we might expect that the familicide rate would have fallen in parallel with the intimate partner homicide rate, the single killings, but it hasn't. In fact, it's moved in a different direction. So that is somewhat counterintuitive, and we can discuss that. I don't know what the reason might be for that, but I'll try and explore that and perhaps address some of those things. So for me, in the spirit of we can't predict and things aren't what they seem, I approach this question of really what drives the phenomenon of familicide. What lies at the root of this behavior, if indeed there is a root of this behavior? What's happening? And I drew upon a vast array of literature for this, but I also was cognizant of the wonderful work done by some of our mental health professionals, some of the psychologists and psychiatrists who've done work in this field. I also looked very closely at the work of historians. So what I'm about to share with you and my perspective is based upon the fact that I am a sociologist, but also sort of an amateur historian of sorts as well. I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist or a clinician, although I have an enormous amount of respect for that work. So I was interested too to discern if there was anything in the psychologists and psychiatrists' reports of the intensity of shame operating in these cases, as much as I was interested in the workings of power and control and some of the wonderful work being done by folks in that field. So I wanted to draw from both perspectives to see if I could synthesize some of those things. It's about the problems associated with westernization, Christianization, colonization. So these were interesting perspectives. So I wanted to weigh all of those things as I moved forward with really no particular axe to grind in any direction. My approach was a sort of a mix of the haphazard and the fairly systematic. Haphazard in the sense that I do probably 10 death reviews a year in different communities in the US. I'm involved in cases, I travel to communities, I sit and listen to case reviews, etc. So I came across a number of familicides over the last 15 years, just professionally in the course of my work. So that was the haphazard side of this. Very detailed, but very haphazard. The more systematic side of it was that our research team were involved in newspaper accounts and other accounts from criminal justice connections that we had of familicides that we knew about. So I looked at a sample of familicides from the period 1755 to 2007, and I collected a sample of 211 cases of familicide that meet the definition. So it was a fairly significant sample size, although the statisticians wouldn't necessarily be thrilled with it, they would like more. The first thing that I realized was that familicide was a uniquely modern phenomenon. In some ways, familicide seems to be one of the emotional consequences of modern life. And that's one of the principal arguments that I ended up making, just to summarize things at the front end. With increasing urbanization, industrialization, with the breakdown of community mores to some extent, and sociologists to the right and the left have written extensively about these things, what we see is a decline in community life. We see alienation, we see a sense of normlessness in communities, some people being cut adrift. We see the rise of individual rights, the rise of individual notions of liberty. We see what Emil Durkheim, the famous sociologist, called the rise of the cult of the individual. Greater social mobility. A phenomenal number of developments in a very, very short period of time. I don't want to paint the picture that modernity and modern life is all bleak and about demise of community life. It isn't. Clearly, it's complex. There are pros and cons. Modern life is about enormous emotional opportunities. It's about getting to know people further afield. It's about being concerned about human rights and people overseas, about developing markets. So there are complexities here. But it seems that the first familicide dates to that tumultuous period. Actually, the first one was in the state of Pennsylvania in 1755, when a gentleman by the name of John Myrack murdered his wife and 2 children, brutally murdered them, mutilated them. It was the first in the historical record. Now, I was very particular about this because the historical record, as you well know, is somewhat scarce as we go back into medieval times. So I spent a lot of time reading medieval and early modern history, and while we see killings within families, we do not see the demise of the entire nuclear family unit. And in many ways, that nuclear family unit did not exist in the same form during those earlier periods of time. Dr. Sharp's work, he works in England, is a well-known historian, has studied homicide-suicides, looked at 431 homicide-suicides from the period of the early 1600s through the early 1700s, and what he found, that early modern period, what he found was out of those 431 cases in the Essex Assizes, the circuit courts, there was only one homicide-suicide in a family and no familicides. Extensive research. When we look at further back to the research in England, where the historical record is quite good, or in other Western European cultures where the historical record is less good but reasonable, we do not find the phenomenon of familicide. So it begs the question, is there a link between familicide and modern life? Is that one of the keys to our understanding? In the early American Republic, in 1782 in Connecticut, in Weatherfield, Connecticut, William Beadle, a very respectable, and you can probably Google this and see this case yourself, you'll see the early, this was the first sort of Gothic tale in American cultural history. Various folks of cultural criticism folks have written about this case, but William Beadle was a very respectable businessman, and who moved to Weatherfield from England in 1762, and he spent a period of time building up his business. He was a very honorable man, but he was a deist. He was an unorthodox person in his religious beliefs. He was known to be fiscally very conservative, ultra respectable In 1782, he was facing bankruptcy. He killed his wife and 3 children. The documentation on this case is extensive. We have documentation from his lawyer who actually found the bodies at the house. Very long true crime accounts sort of things in those days. William Beadle was what was called a sort of soft patriarch, emblematic of the changes in the family that Stone describes as effective individualism. William Beadle was a softer, indulgent parent. He was a loving husband. When the community was canvassed about that, this was the information that they gave. Now, we're very suspicious. I've been doing domestic violence research for a long time, and I'm very suspicious when I hear these stories. But I've now gone through enough cases where I'm convinced that a significant number of these killings occur without a prior history of domestic violence. In the early Republic, what we begin to see is a link between freedom and all these changes and the phenomenon of familicide. Very interestingly, when we look at the American data, the first African American familicide occurs in 1870, at the same time as we have that post-Civil War period where the African American community, the black community, begins to see the benefits, the end of the Civil War, and the freeing of the slaves. So again, a link there between liberty and familicide. It's ironic, it's curious, it may be spurious, but to me it was suggestive. So my focus is on what I like to call the emotional styles of perpetrators. And by emotional styles, I draw upon the sociology of emotions, but I also draw upon that rich psychological literature and psychiatric literature as well. And by emotional style, I'm really referring to the way in which individuals adopt a certain emotional demeanor vis-a-vis each other. And this is where I part company with some of the psych folks who tend to focus on individuals. My focus as a sociologist, as someone who instinctively dives to the left of the boat, is to focus on interactions between people. So for me, when I talk about, for example, the emotion of shame or humiliation, I'm talking about something profoundly social. Shame doesn't exist as a phenomenon attached to individuals any more than power exists as a phenomenon that sits on some individual's shoulder. These things are socially situated, and they only have meaning in a social context. So when we talk about people wielding power individually, this can be troubling. This can be difficult. I know what we mean, but it can be troubling. So my focus is on emotional styles as a social phenomenon. And what I did was to take those early historical examples and try to use that logic throughout the 211 cases that I analyzed. And I actually analyzed those 211 cases using quantitative approaches and qualitative approaches. I asked 112 closed-ended questions of the 211 cases. It took a long, long time to do that. There was a lot of missing data, as there always is in these cases. And believe me, when you spend a lot of time, as I do, working with family members, you realize more and more, as we do our risk work, we have to be cognizant of this sort of missing data phenomenon in our risk assessment work. It really is hazardous for us doing this stuff. So what I developed was this idea of an emotional continuum to try to understand familicide. So I wanted to blend the social, the historical, the individual emotional character of someone, the temperament, livid coercive hearts. And I use the word heart deliberately because I wanted to speak about the sociology of feeling, but I wanted to talk about that in terms of familial atmospheres of feeling and the way in which structures of feeling change over modern life, because they do change in modern life very much. So we have the livid coercive hearts at one end of the continuum, livid left-hand end, realizing unit. Now to the right-hand end, we have what I called civil reputable hearts. And these are a very different proposition indeed. John Myrack was from the left-hand end. William Beadle was from the right-hand end. The livid coercive hearts are classic domestic violence batterers in many ways. And I'm going to talk about one particular case in some detail to illustrate that. But livid coercive hearts engage in long-term, ongoing campaigns of tyranny, violence, intimidation in their relationships. Often the violence is less important than the emotional content of their attempts to control, their attempts to degrade and humiliate. Of the livid coercive hearts that I identified in my sample of 211 cases, and you have to realize that this is an inexact science, I identified 77 livid coercive hearts, 76 of whom were male. Domestic homicide, familicide are very rare offenses. We know this. But there is absolutely no question in my mind that these are gendered and that these reflect gendered patterns in communities. I think the relationship between gender and power and issues in communities, the relationship between that and the homicide is very complicated, and I'll maybe speak to some of those things later, or try to at least. So what we see in those relationships are the classic things that we look for: a prior history of domestic violence, separation perhaps in the relationship going on prior to the killing, obsessive possessiveness, morbid jealousy, saturation with drug and alcohol use, vulnerability on the part of the victim, immigrant status, for example, on the part of the victim. We see a number of different aspects of the victim's life. We see perhaps unemployment. We see the threat posed by a job loss. We see a willingness to flout authority in many ways, whether it's overtly or covertly, etc. We see all the things that we often look for in our sort of risk assessment. Those are the livid coercive hearts. And we looked very carefully and documented prior histories of violence in those cases. So that's one side. The right-hand end of the continuum, the civil reputable hearts, were very different. The livid coercive hearts were mostly poorer, working class, marginal to the market economy in some ways, often sporadically employed. The civil reputable hearts were much more solidly entrenched in the middle class. In some ways, they had a lot more to lose economically in terms of their social standing. They had a greater distance to fall. Free fall for them, the impact would probably be greater than it would be for the livid coercive hearts. But these were people who were often pillars of the community, rather like William Beadle was. These are people who went to church. These are people who did the right things. These are people who were seen as gentle husbands. These are people who were described as somewhat taciturn, unwilling perhaps to share their emotions. In some cases, we even had them described as almost emotionally constipated. You could argue that across that continuum, what we see is a range of emotional styles, from very much under-controlled emotion at the livid coercive end to very much over-controlled emotion at the civil reputable end. This is a continuum, so it is not a typology. People always want to push me to a typology. These are not exact types. It's a continuum. In between, there were a lot of cases which I call contradictory intermediate cases. There were 47 civil reputable hearts in my analysis. 47. 40 of them were men. 7 of them were women. Women commit familicide. They do it very, very rarely, but they do it. In those 7 cases where women committed familicide, in 2 of those 7, I was able to, by going back through the historical record, I interviewed one family on the phone 50 years after the killing. This woman's sister was murdered, her family, murdered her husband and her 2 children, then killed herself. I went back 50 years to interview that person, that sister. And it was only through a long interview with her, an analysis of the autopsy data, the coroner's report, the police data, the newspaper reports, that I realized that this was a domestic violence case, that this woman was in fact a tyrannized, battered woman who killed. So I caution you about the women who committed familicide. I identified 2 of them as battered women. There may have been more, I don't know. But other women amongst that group killed when their children were ill or sick, or they were ill or sick, or in 2 cases where their husbands were both moving on to other women. So there was sexual humiliation in those 2 cases. There were a number of cases, and I'm looking at my notes here, there were 48 of them, where I really had insufficient information. 2 specific cases. One that I've been involved with very closely, and one that is perhaps known to some of you through the literature over the years. The first is a case of livid coercion, and I'm using pseudonyms here for several reasons. When I do this research, as I say, I do sometimes get to know the family members and interview them in our fatality review work. So it's very hard for me to keep separate in my head when I present the public, the private, and the confidential information legally and ethically. So I present this particular case using pseudonyms with that in mind. But this case, the case of Kevin Oxley, Kevin murdered his 7-year-old daughter and his 6-year-old son, murdered his wife, and then he attempted to set the house on fire before shooting himself in the head. This was a case that absolutely traumatized the community where it occurred. I won't name the state or even the region, but this case occurred in the early 2000s, and the community came together to conduct a very, very detailed domestic violence fatality review of that death, bringing together all members, all agencies in the community, and all those other folks who may have been touched by that case, including interviewing Kevin's stepmother, who had raised Kevin since the age of 10, and Bonnie Oxley's mother, Georgina Lessing, who came to the table. And I've got to know Georgina over the years. I interviewed Kevin's mother, stepmother, I'm sorry, and I interviewed Georgina many years ago in the wake of the fatality review. And I remember this case really well because at the review, Georgina Lessing testified about the loss of her daughter. She testified to the fatality review group. She spent many hours in interview with those folks. And Connie Oxley, Kevin's stepmother, also testified. She spent 4 hours with the fatality review team talking about her life. And Connie said, she told me afterwards that she was deeply, deeply relieved to share her life and Kevin's life with the fatality review team. It was cathartic for her because up to that point, the community had tended to treat her as if she was a pariah. As if she, and this is her precise language to me, as if she had spawned a monster. That was the response. So when she spoke with the review team, it was highly cathartic for her. So I interviewed both those mothers, one stepmother, one biological mother, in the wake of the killing. About 4 or 5 years later, I was in that same state also on fatality review business, and I arranged to have breakfast with Georgina Lessing. And her daughter Bonnie had been killed by Kevin 5 years previous. And Georgina and I met for the first time physically. We'd talked on the phone before. And we sat and chatted about the case, and she'd brought a photograph album to the restaurant that we were having breakfast at, and we sat and chatted, and at the end of our conversation, which probably lasted 2 hours, we just shot the breeze, and she said to me, "I want to share something with you, Neil." And I said, "Oh, that's cool. What is it?" And I looked at it, and I knew it was a photograph album. I could see from the outside, but I thought she was going to share with me photographs about her grandkids, their life. And what she had compiled was a photographic log of Kevin's life. And it contained pictures of Kevin on the seismic crew that he worked on sporadically when he wasn't unemployed in the winter. It contained pictures of Kevin with some of his workmates. Had pictures of Kevin as a young boy that she'd got from the family album. Had pictures of the glass that Kevin had broken on one occasion to break into the house. And I said to her, "This is about Kevin's life." And she said to me, "I want you to understand something." I said, "I want to tell you about Kevin's life, not because I forgive Kevin, but because since the review process, since the unearthing of this information, it's become clear to me that Kevin's life was basically pretty damned horrific." And she said, "I don't say that out of a sentiment of, oh, poor Kevin, or that Kevin shouldn't have been accountable for his behavior. I say that," she said, "out of the spirit of understanding and trying to come to terms with this. So let me share with you some of the things that I learned through these interviews, through the documents, through the fatality review process, and other things about Kevin, about his wife Bonnie. Bonnie was 10 years younger than Kevin. They met when Bonnie was 14, when Kevin was 24 years old. That, the statisticians tell us alone, is a bit of a risk marker there, that age difference, but let's not concern ourselves with that too much. Bonnie became pregnant when she was 14 years old. Georgina told me that she decided to support the two of them rather than go after Kevin on charges of statutory rape. They were married eventually, and they lived together. They had 2 children. By the age of 8, when we look back at Kevin's life, Kevin was smoking marijuana and using alcohol. There was actually a family photograph of Kevin in a field smoking dope. His biological mother had encouraged him, it seems from the record, to smoke dope. Kevin was heavily addicted by the age of 13 and 14. His school records showed that he had a serious addiction to alcohol. He was institutionalized when he was 15, where his stepmother suspected he was sexually assaulted. And Kevin eventually went through the juvenile justice system, suffered from depression. His medical records showed that by the age of 14 he was on antidepressants, long history of familial depression. Things I noticed in the Kevin Oxley case, but in many of the other cases of livid coercive familicide, was a failure to attach in early life. Now, we didn't have all the data, the files. There's a dearth of data in the files in some of these cases. But with the livid coercive offenders, there was often, if they didn't commit suicide, there was an often attempt to prosecute them. So there was a file developed, there was a pre-sentence investigation report, there was documentation that went back There was a psychosocial, so we had a lot of that data. It was very helpful for us. So learning about someone's early socialization strikes me as very important. This does not mean that everyone who has these problems commits familicide. Obviously it doesn't. Only a very small number do. But one thing that strikes me as important amongst the livid coercive hearts is that they seem to be very isolated as human beings, even although their bluster and their threats and their arrogance and their sense of entitlement and their attempts to control may give the impression that they're something else. They are, as Kevin Oxley was, and this is what Georgina Lessing told me, I realized after a number of years, even before the familicide, that Kevin was in fact extremely dependent and extremely vulnerable in many ways. Doesn't excuse his behavior, but he was. Bonnie had discovered a few months before the familicide that Kevin had had an affair with another woman. She interviewed the other woman. She found the other woman. She went to interview her. She took a tape recorder. She recorded the conversation. She was 23 years old when she did this. Kevin was 33. She told her mother, Georgina Lessing, she told her, said, I've put up with a lot of stuff from Kevin. And Georgina did not know that Kevin had been battering her on and off for 10 years. And Georgina did not know that. But Bonnie said to her, I've put up with a lot of stuff from him, but I will not put up with him being with another woman. So she taped it, she recorded it, and then she took the tape to Kevin. She played it in front of him because he denied it. She was suspicious about it before. When she confronted him, she'd made sure that her 2 children were with Georgina at Georgina's house. And she told her mother, she said, whatever you do, don't let Kevin take the kids. And Georgina told me, and she actually told an audience last week in Florida the same thing. She said, I didn't know what she was telling me at that time. Why would she tell me, don't let him take the kids? So anyway, Georgina knew that her daughter was going to confront Kevin about his infidelity. She had the kids in the house, they were playing. But a couple of hours later, she hears this screeching vehicle outside the house. Kevin turns up. He jumps out. Georgina locks both doors. She realizes something's wrong. He goes to the back of the house. Georgina tells her older daughter there at the time, call the police. Kevin takes a golf club. He smashes his way through the back window. There's broken glass, shards of glass all around the square, 2-foot square window. Kevin literally crawls in through the window, cutting himself in the process. Blood everywhere. He comes in. Georgina lays over the 7-year-old and the 6-year-old. He grabs the 7-year-old. He leaves the house, takes off. Georgina said to me she said at the time, she said she'd never seen such rage, such anger, and such emotional coldness when he took those kids, or took one of the kids actually, he didn't take the son. The daughter was eventually returned. Bonnie moved out of the house that she'd shared with Kevin. Within 3 days of moving out, he'd killed them all and then killed himself. Now, the sequence of events in this is sort of classic domestic violence killing in many ways. We see many of the markers in this case that we see in other cases. I want now to move on to the civil reputable end of the continuum in the case of John List. John List is a well-known case in the United States. List, and this was a case from 1971, it's a Westfield, New Jersey case. List was a very respectable member of the community. He was a member of the Lutheran Church. He was the vice president of a bank. He was ultra respectable. He used to mow his lawn with his collar and tie on. I know, I don't recommend it. Ultra respectable. Very strict disciplinarian with his children, but by all accounts, and we have a lot of information on this case, John was very deferential to his wife in many ways. He was never violent. He was very placid. And everyone I read who talked about this case, and there's a lot of literature on this case, talked about John's deference and actually John's fear of his wife in some ways. And whether that's accurate or not, who knows? We do this work, we're skeptical. But nevertheless, his wife had become addicted to alcohol and sleeping pills, and she also had a major case of syphilis that was fast deteriorating. John was very worried about the direction his kids were moving. This was in the aftermath of the 60s. He saw his kids as very permissive. His wife did not want to go to church with him. She was sick of the church. She refused to go. John was rendered unemployed 6 months before his act of familicide. He was let go at the bank. John was very inexpressive emotionally. Over control would be a strange word, a generous word to describe John. He never told anyone that they let him go. He had a high position at the bank, they let him go. He was too obsessive, wasn't creative. He was a bit of a dinosaur in that time, for various reasons. He spent the next 6 months getting up, dressing in his collar and tie, and going off to what his wife thought and his kids thought was work. He lived out in a mansion in the country. The wife was largely in the house, with her addiction, with her despair. Kids went to school. John went to work. What he later wrote was that he was going into New York City, looking for work, hanging out, going to the library, parking his car by the railway station, just staying there, reading, doing whatever. My point here is that John was an incredibly secretive man. Secretive emotionally and secretive in terms of his actions. No one knew what John was doing. After 6 months, he began to sell insurance from his house. He couldn't keep up the charade anymore. He began to sell insurance from his house. And by the time, weeks before he committed familicide, he killed his wife and 3 kids. Weeks before he was facing bankruptcy, there was a pending foreclosure on his mortgage. He was facing total humiliation as a financier. He was deeply humiliated by this. His shame, his humiliation, was something that he recognized later, but he did not recognize at the time. Did John have power over his wife economically? Yes. Just as Kevin on the other end felt ashamed of that, but he didn't necessarily realize that was what he was ashamed of. John failed to live up to those prescriptions, and in fact later in interviews, because when John killed his 3 kids, he didn't kill himself. He killed his wife, he killed his 3 kids, and then he had planned this meticulously. He left the music playing at the mansion, he locked the mansion up, and he split for Denver, where he lived for 18 more years. He remarried, and he was caught by America's Most Wanted TV show after living 18 more years in Denver with a new life, completely new life. List, I suggest to you, killed, and he said later, he was so ashamed he couldn't commit suicide. It was against his religious beliefs and his general principles. He couldn't go on welfare. That was against his principles. And as he wrote later, and he died 2 years ago, as he wrote later from his prison cell, to be on welfare was not to be a man. What we see in the modern era are certain emotional prescriptions about how to be a man. And the prescriptions about controlling emotion were very much directed at men and not women, particularly upper class men and middle class men. Reining in emotion is something, if you look at the histories, the advice manuals, the classic is Lord Chesterfield's letters to his son that were published and published in many editions in the 1770s. Phenomenal influence on parenting practices. Lord Chesterfield's letters to his son. If you read those letters, they're remarkable documents. They influence the way men internalize how to be as men in a new market economy, a new politic, a new political arrangement with individual rights. Men had to be measured in their comportment and their emotional demeanor. It was not good to betray emotion. However you felt, you presented as if you were the same, you were comfortable, you were cool. The word tantrum appears in 1810 as a negative connotation, a term that was used in English theatre in the late 1700s, but it was a term that came on board in the American scene, North American continent, around 1810. It was a pejorative term, a negative term about, inappropriate displays of anger. In other words, you rein in your anger. What we see with the emotional continuum for familicide is a skewed relationship with anger. An under-controlled at one end, the livid coercive end, and over-controlled at the other end. Anger's crucial. What we see throughout is a submerging of shame. It's important for us to ask with perpetrators or people we suspect who are going through major life changes and changes in their circumstances, if they're depressed, if they've suffered bankruptcy, loss of a job, it's important to ask what juncture they're at in their life. Because the livid coercive cases may be things that we can discern from our risk markers that we've already talked about today. But the civil reputable folks are an entirely different matter. They are going to be very, very difficult for us to track, and their numbers, the number of cases, albeit small, are very disturbing. And that doesn't even count the number of times folks contemplate or fantasize about killing their family members. So this is disproportionately, way disproportionately masculine behavior because the cultural strictures were directed at men. In the rising capitalist economy, it was men who were the ones who were the providers. The word breadwinner emerges culturally in 1820. It's the same idea. The man is the breadwinner. This is not to say, oh, poor burdened man, but it's to say we need to pay attention because the familicides are about, I think, failure to live up to the ideological imperatives of our notions of masculinity. Which is why it strikes me as very encouraging that there's a lot of work going on here around some of these issues of masculinity. But people always ask me, well, what can we do? And I want to open that up for questions. I'm running right out of time, so I have to end now. But it seems to me that there are a couple of ways we can move. One is to use the apparatus of the criminal justice system and the modern state to target offenders who are particularly tyrannical, who are very violent, and put those men away for long periods of time. But if we're going to do that, then we have to be prepared to gather the evidence to do that. And I would suggest that we think carefully about how we do our evidence collection. How we, for example, gather letters, text messages, documents, jail tapes, intimidating calls from jails where offenders make calls even though they're told the calls are recorded, where they attempt to tamper with evidence in domestic violence cases, where they write letters to women saying, oh, you turn up at court to talk about the violence that I meted out on you, you're dead, bitch. There are ways of taking that information, and we need to be smart about this, that not only acknowledge them as confessions, but enable us to use the conspiracy laws, the tampering information, tampering with witnesses, soliciting perjury. There are things that we can do within the system to overturn some of this stuff and use it to our advantage. But I think Evan Stark mentions this in his latest book, and this is an important observation. The system is clogged. We have to do a better job of triaging. There's a lot of low-level stuff that we may not want to process, and we have to get better about triaging. And it's difficult, because as some of the researchers you'll hear from tomorrow, Russell and Rebecca Dobash, have pointed out, we have to be cautious about this variable that we have, prior history of domestic violence. There are a significant number of cases where there is no prior history. So we can't just be looking at that variable. We have to look at all the other emotional dynamics in the relationship and the other things that are going on. It's very important. So we need a wide-angled lens approach when we do this work. Then there's a whole other area of this, I think, which I was so thrilled to hear last night when we listened to the achievements here in this community and Kevin's work with Homefront. And these are community, cultural changes that we need to think about too. If we're going to change this behavior, we need to be talking about cultural ideas about what it is to be a man, a successful man, what it is to be a woman. And I think the younger generation are moving in some of these directions already. Ideas about gender are changing dramatically, subversively, and I think in some ways for the better. So there are cultural ways we can move, and there are punitive ways that we can move. But I want to end on this note. I think that if we approach this humanistically, which is the way we approach our fatality review work, then we have to be prepared to listen to a wide range of opinions on, what causes this stuff. And we also have to be prepared to work with perpetrators in a compassionate and humane way as well.
Dr. Websdale looked at the emotional styles of these perpetrators, and placed them into two distinct categories. He concluded that shame and anger were the driving force behind most familicides. David Wilson of the Birmingham City University has separated family annihilators into 4 separate groups. He studied the motives behind the family murders over 3 decades. First is the ANOMIC family annihilator. The ANOMIC killer views his family as a status symbol. When finances or other things are imploding, his idea of family implodes with it. Christopher Foster is the ANOMIC family annihilator. He had given his family a wealthy lifestyle, but that lifestyle was crumbling around him due to his bad business dealings. Their mansion was days away from being repossessed. Instead of allowing this to happen, he shot his wife and daughter, killing them, then burning down the mansion with them all, including himself, inside. Next is the disappointed family annihilator. The disappointed family annihilator is angry, or upset that his family is not living up to what he feels his family should be. Mohammed Riaz is a prime example of the disappointed family annihilator. His family was falling away from his Muslim traditions, and this angered him. His oldest daughter was not falling into his belief in arranged marriage. She was planning on marrying someone else she had fallen in love with. Instead of letting this happen, he set fire to their house with all children inside, including his wife. He attempted to commit suicide, but survived the initial fire, but died of his horrific injuries a few days later. Third is the self-righteous family annihilator. The self-righteous killer murders his family for revenge. He blames the mother, and the best way to hurt their mother is killing her children and sometimes her too. In some cases it's that the murderer feels they are superior and have the right to decide their family's fate. They usually are narcissists or covert narcissists who've hidden behind a nice guy facade for decades. These type of cases are never spontaneous, and usually well planned. This is the case with Chris Watts. Everyone who knew him felt he was a nice guy who adored his wife and kids. But underneath it all, he was secretly having an affair and wanted rid of his family. He coldly strangled his pregnant wife, then violently smothered both his daughters, even with one of them begging him not to. And fourth is the paranoid family annihilator. The paranoid killer murders their family in an attempt to protect them from something they feel is far worse, usually unfounded but in their mind is very real. Alan Hoare is the paranoid family annihilator. He was secretly watching porn and pleasuring himself at work. When this was revealed and repercussions were pending, he decided to murder his 3 sons and wife to keep them from the shame. It appears in many cases shame and sometimes anger are the main driving forces. The idea that something they've done will be known to others becomes too much for them to bear. Or losing their wealth is embarrassing and shameful to them, and it's not something they can deal with. And in some cases, losing control over their family brings anger. It's important to remember familicides are rare. Research has shown that the perpetrator of familicide is not always an abusive person. He may actually be one of the nicest guys in the community. He may be wealthy, go to church, never show signs of anger issues or violence, never have a criminal record and may be, by all accounts, a happily married man who loves his wife and children. Or he could be someone who can't keep a steady job and has a history of abuse. Usually, there's something that triggers them into committing familicide. Usually it's shame from knowing their home may be repossessed or losing their job. Maybe they are having an affair and this changes their whole outlook on their family. They become disposable. It's really difficult to prevent, due to the vast differences in perpetrators and the cases being so rare. More research is needed in attempts to find ways to prevent this from happening.